Okay, hi everyone. So yeah, my name is Ludovic Righetti, and so the field I'm really comfortable of talking about is optimal control and reinforcement learning for leg robots and also for manipulation. I'm not very comfortable talking about dual use issues in robotics, but I happen to have had worked a little bit on this issue, and I'll discuss a bit more about that. So before I go into the problem of dual use issues, I just wanted to do a little bit of advertisement. So I'm part of the RARPEC, which is a committee that looks at so it's a standing committee of the IEEE Robotics and Automation Society that looks at the ethical impacts of robotics and try to potentially make recommendations about issues in robotics and automation research, and also about the usage that can pose ethical questions. And its frame as in its goal is that ethical questions for humanity. And so we've been organizing workshops, but it seems that there's many people who are actually doing exciting workshops like this one. So we haven't done this so much. What we've done recently is that we started to publish in the Robotics and Automation magazine column that is called Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues, where we try to discuss, take a theme and try to discuss what, from our perspective as roboticists, about a certain theme. And so we always look at people that may be interested in helping us be part of this committee. We're always welcome. So why am I talking about this? Because we started to publish, the first thing we published is about lethal autonomous weapon systems, and I'm going to use quite some things that we wrote about that in my discussion today. We also discuss about jobs and robotics. We discuss about bias and in robotics and AI, and how this is a problem for applications in robotics. And the most recent one, we discussed about funding, how our funding sources can be an issue in our practice, and there's a significant part of that is about military applications. So I'm going to talk about on this as well in my talk today. So what is dual use? So dual use is basically when you basically develop a civilian technology and that it's used also for military applications. So that's usually this idea that you can use a technology that you develop that is used both for civilian applications of society and also basically to make weapons, to put it short, or at least that is used in the military in a way that is, let's say, an offensive way, right? The use of a car by the military is not a dual use application in that sense. So today, I'm going to make an hypothesis because otherwise I don't have much to say. I'm going to assume that that I care and that we should care about applications of military in robotics technology, and that that matters, and maybe that we should care that we should not use so much or at all automation in military applications, or at least think about how they should be regulated. And the goal of the talk is to say, so what is our role here? What do we do about that? So I don't mean to give you an answer to that because I think it's a very difficult question, but at least let's say that we can evacuate the two choices that say, well, we cannot do anything about it, so let's not care, because otherwise I can just stop my talk here and there's nothing to talk about. And the other things say, well, things are horrible, so we should not develop technology. And then basically there's no point of being at ICRA because we should stop having ICRA whatsoever, right? But so what can we do in between, right? So what are the tools that we have, and what are basically and I'm going to try to take a few examples from my own experience. So what we might be able to do in trying to play a role in the how robotics is using military application. So dual use, what does it mean? So maybe the first straightforward example of a dual use robotics application is unmanned aerial vehicles, right? Drones. So drones are used in agriculture. They more recently are being used for search and rescue operations. So we will argue these are things that are, pretty cool, or at least they're very, very useful for many things. But as you all know, right, drones are infamously used for military applications, especially the US drone programs, which is an extrajudicial killing program, basically that basically targets people in countries where the US is not at war with, and is outside any international regulations. And so what is interesting here is that if you read reports from Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or any basically people who work on the actual policy and the concrete effects of the drone program, is that the actual technology, so the autonomy part of the drone, is what makes this program possible, because you would not be able to do that if you had pilots inside, for different reasons, for operational reasons, because you cannot have a pilot stay 12, 15 hours in the sky. That's not really doable. There's also practical reasons that if you have people in a drone, you're basically, if you have people in a plane, you're basically declaring war in a country if you go there. So there's much more reasons, and I really recommend, if you're interested, to read the reports that people have written about that. So, so this is a program that is used as an offensive way, and actually it's mostly secret. So it's very hard to know actually how it's used. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism is trying to keep a record on that since the inception of the program under George W. Bush. The program has just been increasing every new president, so it's getting worse and worse all the time, but it basically kills quite a fair amount of civilians. Again, it's very hard to know exactly how many. This is a minimum number that you see here. But this is basically something that has actually the automation. So basically what we do and the kind of technology that we develop in a society is being used in a military application that does actually have a very significant impact in how policy and military policy is used in the world today. So that's one example. Another example is facial recognition. So it doesn't really concern us maybe directly, but I think it does to some extent. So facial recognition, right? Nice. I use actually facial recognition to unlock my iPad, so you'd argue it's very useful. Obviously, the facial recognition raises a lot of issues that go much beyond dual use, right? There's a lot of problems about privacy, about that. I mean, it's really about discrimination. That, I mean, it's clearly a very hot topic. But this is a key technology in the development of a military application. So basically, the military is trying to tap into civilian development. So machine learning, civilian development of the AI machine learning is much more advanced than the military right now. So the military is really trying to transfer this technology to their applications because they need that for the development of, it goes from increasing their intelligence capabilities to actually developing more autonomous weapon systems. This is a key technology if you want to be able to target and automatically decide to shoot, right? So this is a very important example. And I use these two examples because you might know right now in the US, I guess you all know, right? There's a big demonstrations and uprising against well, for the murder of George Floyd, but mostly because of the bigger issue of institutionalized racism. So a lot of people are in the streets, and drones of facial recognition are used, and actually it's by the police to actually track demonstrators, right? And it's very useful for them because they can realize who is a leader in the demonstration. They can track people, they can recognize who is in the demonstrations, and they can use actually that to enforce policies to try to tame down these demonstrations. And also it's a very strong example of how a military application transfer into civilian use very quickly. So even if you develop things, you say it doesn't really matter because it's going to be used in another country where we'll never go, and it will kill people I don't really care about. Well, actually it's not really true because it's going to go back to you very quickly. So actually it does matter even more, I believe, because anything that transfers from civilian to military goes back to civilian in terms of law enforcement very quickly. And especially for any types of automation and machine learning technology, because it can be used for crowd control or any type of things like that, and surveillance applications. All right. So what can we do about that? So you might have already understood I have very strong feelings about those things. But so what can we do as scientists, right? So how do we deal with this issue? And if you think that this is an issue, this was my hypothesis at the beginning of the talk. How do we think about this? So I think we can do three things. That's most likely not the only thing we can do, but I'd like to argue we can do three things. The first thing, we can use the fact that we know this technology to provide expertise, to educate, and to help shape policies that actually are meaningful. The second thing I think we can do is we can take position. Basically, we be citizens and try to basically be part of the debate. Say, if I develop a robot or certain types of technology, this is the range of applications that I think should be used for, and these are the range of applications I'm completely against. And I think this is also part of what we say we will do as part of the Robotics Automation Society. And the third thing I'd like to discuss is basically question our own practices, and maybe start to rethink about how we practice and how we fund mostly robotics in general. Again, that's not the only ways, but I think they're interesting to discuss. Maybe that helps to have a larger discussion afterwards. So provide expertise. I'd like to take this from my own experience. I'd like to discuss about lethal autonomous weapon systems that are also called killer robots. So again, we are not discussing about this, right? And that's where basically the expertise of roboticists is very useful, because when we see a Terminator, we all know this makes no sense. Nobody's working on that. There's not even a technology you can even imagine having in the near future, right? But that's not the issue, right? That's not what we're discussing. What we're discussing is more things like that, things that are much simpler from a robotics perspective, but actually are deployed, right? And can be deployed. So an autonomous weapon systems is usually understood as a robot that is capable to autonomously acquire a target, right? So that's where facial recognition kicks in, and decide to shoot, right? So basically the automatic decision of shooting is a key part of that. And now the automatic decision of shooting can be blurred, because it really depends what the human has as control, right? So it can really depend on how much information the person has when he decides to shoot, right? You can go from I have a target, and then you click yes or no, and you don't know anything about this target, just you know what the robot told you, to you basically have full information about what's going on, right? And it can be anything in between. Okay, so these things are currently being researched, some of them are being deployed. I do not think as of now that they have been used in a real battlefield, but I'm not sure about that. There's a lot of things we don't know also. So how does discussion started? And how do we play a role here? So basically it started in 2013 when the special reporter on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions, Christoph Jens, basically wrote a report about this topic and said we need to do something, and states need to review their processes and how they design systems that have certain degrees of autonomy, and they basically argued that they should be highly regulated. At the same time, Human Rights Watch and other organizations started what is called the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which I think made a lot of link, at least in the public mind, about Terminators. And again, this is not what we're talking about. But they basically started a campaign saying we need regulation. And I think their campaign basically really talks about they want a ban on the use of fully autonomous weapon systems. And they argue that on ethical, legal, policy, and also technical reasons. So that's the framework. So when it started, there was a convention on conventional weapons. That's the annual meeting at the UN where they discuss about weapons and how they should be regulated. And nations agreed that they should work on this problem. They should think about this and potentially later discuss whether or not they should be regulated. So the interesting thing here is that, as far as I know, that's the first international multilateral discussion about robotics or about autonomous systems, right? Which is telling, right? The first time states started in multilateral agreements or discussions about things that we're doing actually is about the deployment of weapons. So there's a lot of discussions, a lot of expert meetings. I actually was part of certain of these meetings, discussion at the UN. There's a lot of press releases. There's a lot of research work that has been done on the technical side, on the ethical side, on the legal side. Try to really understand what does it mean, what are we talking about. How do we need regulation? Some people think we do need regulation. Some people don't. Some people don't agree on the kind of regulation there should be. So there's a lot of discussions. In 2016, the state at the CCW, so the Convention on Conventional Weapons, made a special group of government experts that are basically tasked to basically discuss more in detail those questions, and potentially this will lead to, that's the first step to potentially go towards regulation. So basically they try to discuss whether it's necessary. So what is the nature of human control? What does it mean to have autonomous weapons? What does it mean to have meaningful human control? So one of the big discussion right now is basically what is the level of control that humans should retain, and how does it fit into international regulation, right? And what does it mean, basically? Which is a very difficult problem because it's really a technical problem as well. So what are the risks, right, associated to that? What happens if it fails? How do you make sure that you can certify those things so they can pass weapons reviews? Is it compliant with international humanitarian law, right, the laws of war? And then there's moral and ethical questions that are associated to that. And one of the things that the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research said is that it's very important discussion, because it's also a discussion that might frame other discussions we might have about robotics technology, autonomous technology. So a relationship basically with technology in general, because a lot of these discussions that are taking place there might serve as a ground of policy for other things we have in the civilian world. So since 2014, I participated to workshop and as a civilian expert for the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and in 2 weeks I will participate to a discussion of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. And basically the goal here is that I provide expertise and try to explain what we can and cannot do, what we might be able to do in the near future, and basically try to explain and try to give guidelines on how do you assess the risk, how do you assess what the technology, what might happen if it fails, and things like that, to try to help people understand how this can be translated into potential policies. So this is very important, right? Because this helps go from a big statement, we talk about killer robots, to looking into the details. What does it mean, and how do we think about that? And so there was a publication like a week ago about this that I was part of one of these meetings that led to one of the publication of these institutions about this problem. So my experience with that is that these organizations, they really like and welcome a lot of technical expertise. Most of the time, they don't even know who to ask, because they don't necessarily know who roboticists are and who to ask to give them expertise. And basically, they really welcome people to help them understand and decipher what technology can and cannot do, and what does it mean, right? And this is fundamental to be able to create meaningful policies that actually target real problems, and not policies that try to do something that will have zero consequences, right? If you ban the use of Terminator, it's pretty much useless because nobody works on that. But if you try to regulate the use of mobile robots that have a gun on it, it's a very different concept, right? So this is very important. Our role here is that to provide expertise, because this is how you frame policies that make sense. So this is as a scientist, and you just provide technical expertise. The other things that you may want to take positions, and that I call be a citizen, right? As a reminder, the Robotics and Automation Society says that one of our missions basically is advance that the things that benefit our profession, members, and humanity. So basically, they care about how what we do, how is it beneficial for humanity. And I do not think it's a scientific thing. It's a thing that really depends on your ethical and moral values. And it's something where we need to take position on. What do we think that actually benefits humanity? So I think one thing we should do is that we need to educate people and get educated about dual use issues. Another thing is that our behavior as a scientist, we need to shape our behavior as well and impose normative behaviors. So inside our community means we might want to think about code of conducts or accepted practices, what we cannot research, what kind of application we should think of, and what we think is okay or not, right? And as a group, if we behave in a certain way, this has also impact in society as general, right? This is an example of the use of chemical weapons, right? Before there was an official ban, people stopped using chemical weapons because society at large didn't approve of that. And so the consequences of doing that in terms of your own society was too big to actually do that. And you don't need actually regulation to stop the use of certain things. You need social pressure, and you also need scientific pressure. So the role of scientists to ban chemical weapons was a huge thing here. It's a very concrete example of what kind of position you can take. You might have heard about the Project Maven, which is a project by the US Department of Defense that basically the goal was is to use machine learning to actually make sense of the video data that they collect in their drone program or other programs and help gather intelligence and basically help target people in the drone program. So Google was involved in that 2017 secretly, right? It was not official. They started to work on this project. And the idea was to transfer civilian technology that they developed. They're clearly, arguably one of the best place in the world in terms of machine learning technology for military applications. So when it was discovered, basically Google claimed that this was used for non-offensive use only, right? So it just flags images for human review. So it has nothing to do with actual military application. As a reminder, right? The drone program is a military application. It kills people, even if at the end you have someone who clicks a button. What is interesting, what I wanted to talk about here is that actually employees at Google took a position and said, this is not acceptable, we refuse, even if you're not directly involved in this project, we refuse that our company actually be involved in that, and we demand that the project be canceled. And Google basically quickly backed down and they withdraw from this project. So that's just as when you take position as a researcher, as an engineer, this actually matters and can matter because your voice might be heard, right? It's not necessarily always the case, but it actually does matter and might change the course of things. So it's very short, right? But I really think that we do have to have an opinion and we need to make it known and we need to take position according to what we think. So the last thing that I wanted to quickly go about for the last couple of minutes. So what about funding? So do we contribute to dual use development when we take money from military sources? So usually we don't say military, we say defense because it's a euphemistic way of talking about military, right? But defense applications are rarely used to defend yourself. Even when we do fundamental research, right? If I do fundamental research, it has zero applications to weapons, right? Then I think that's potentially true. So here's a few food for thought. When you receive money from a funding agency, it has an agenda, right? And they try to influence what we do. And actually, funding agencies say that, right? The National Science Foundation says that they have an impact on robotics research in the world through their National Robotics Initiative program, which is a great program, by the way, right? I think it's a great influence, but they do try to have an influence on the field, right? They change who we work with, right? They decide who you compete against in a competition, right? They decide basically who you're going to work with if you receive funding and you have to work with others. They might also influence the kind of conclusions we may have. So in robotics, we don't talk about this so much, and I don't know if it's a real problem, but in the medical field it is, right? In the pharmaceutical field, it is a huge problem. When you receive funding from private companies, there's a lot of documented cases that actually changes the kind of conclusions you can have implicitly or implicitly, right? You don't want to upset the person who gives you money. So that's for one side, but still, if you do basic research, maybe it doesn't matter, right? You could argue maybe this is not a big issue because since I work on a very fundamental thing, I'm trying to prove in theorems, it's not useful for the military. Here's another take, and I think to me, that's the one that matters the most. When you receive money, so they fund basic science, it's a manner to legitimize an organization. Basically, it's a form of greenwashing. You're under your own reputation by funding people who do cool stuff and who do fundamental research. As an example, DARPA spends roughly 50% of its budget on basic research. It spends most of its budget right on developing weapons. So 80% is on applied research. So basically direct translation of research into military applications. That's actually, you can read that's completely public, right? It's nothing. Only 13% goes to universities, right? Most of it goes to industries that actually develop products that are used for the military. But if you go on their website, you will never be able to say that because what they advertise, right, is that DARPA fights the coronavirus. DARPA develops super chips for security. DARPA invests in AI, right? So if you look at that, you would imagine that they do fundamental research, which they do, but that's not the core of their business, right? I would argue that the fundamental research helps develop what they want to do. It also help build their reputation. They use our science and our reputation to launder their own reputation and make them look like they do. And this is not where they put their money in, right? Most of their money is not spent into what you see on the first page of their website. So I think it does matter because they use our name. So when you take money from a funding agency, it doesn't have to be the military. You actually, they pay for your name as well, right? All right, so I think I'm done. So I tried to go through 3 different things I think we can have an influence, and what we do matters. We wrote about this. If you're interested, you can. And I think that may be the good time to maybe start a discussion and discuss why what I said doesn't make sense.
Great, Ludovic. Thanks very much for your talk. It was very practical, which is what we were looking for. I think about these things myself because I work in legged robotics, and I sometimes think of the consequences of this research. So let's go for questions. We have a question from Tommaso Colombino.
Hi. So I have a question. You mentioned in passing in one of your slides this sort of a more general problem of delegating life or death decisions to autonomous systems. I was curious if you think, because I mean, I understand, you know, a machine gun on wheels is scary and unaccountable and it kills people, but I mean, so does an algorithm that decides not to give health coverage, for example. So I was wondering whether you thought the focus on robotics and military applications is specifically necessary for some reason, or whether it risks being a bit of a distraction from a more general and pervasive problem.
So I think the problem of robotics is that there's a lot of potential issues, right? And I guess this workshop really tackles a lot of them. So clearly, military application is not the only problem. It might not be the most important. I don't know. I don't know how to rank problems, right? It happens that I actually worked on this problem. So that's the thing. I do think that there's potentially there's a lot of wonderful things right about automation. But there's a lot of other problems potentially. The ability to automatically target and kill is actually a real issue, because it's not only about the fact that the robot can decide to kill, but it's about the fact of what happens when it doesn't work, because most weapons do not work as they intended to work. And so the problem of a risk and basically the scale at which you might take a risk is actually a huge issue. In addition to the ethical and moral problems of basically deciding life and death with algorithms. So I do think that this is a real issue, and that there's a real issue that is really enough that a lot of people actually are, even the Secretary General of the United Nations took a stand against autonomous weapon system, right? So it seems to matter enough for him at least to take a stand like that. But again, there's a lot of other issues, obviously.
Great, thanks for the answer. I also have a quick question. So you were talking about robots that autonomously decide to kill. However, there's much robotics research that can be used also for example, teleoperating robots. And this could also be used to dehumanize or gamify killing. So how do you think we can draw a border between killer robots or just technology that is used for killing in general? I think this, yeah, what do you think?
So it's a very interesting, it's a very important question, I think. So the discussion the debates, the thing I was part of, and the discussions I was part of is really the autonomy part. So people are looking at the autonomy and what does it mean, and they basically, one of the key questions they're asking is how do you ensure that people retain meaningful human control? And I think it goes also into this question of dehumanization, right? So meaningful human control, what does it mean? Does it mean that when the robot says, I have a target, press yes or no? That's human control, right? But it's not clearly meaningful because you have no idea what you're doing, right? So basically trying to define what it means and try to define how it should be regulated is actually a big discussion on autonomous weapon systems. So I don't think people are not really discussing so much about the fact that you will have a robot that decides to kill 100 people without anyone looking at it, right? That's not the case. The idea is that you always have someone that makes a decision somewhere. The question is that where is this decision made, and how is it made, and with what kind of information is it made? So I think it matters a lot. now it goes also back to, so the drones that are used right now, they are not part of this discussion, right? But they raise questions. They raise questions that are, I think, very important questions, except that they are not discussed at the international level with what I was discussing, but they are discussed in other fields, right? There's a lot of people who actually discuss the use of drones, and regulating it might be very difficult, but at least you could try to convince states to basically decrease their programs or change what they do, right? And there's a lot of discussions about also like the impact on soldiers who are part of the drone program, post-traumatic stress disorders on people who are in Nevada and shoot people right on the other side of the world. So these are complicated questions. I think they all matter a lot, right? And we should discuss all of those things as well.